In World War II, cold was not an inconvenience. It was a strategic threat. Entire units were rendered ineffective not by gunfire, but by frozen feet. During early winter campaigns, especially on the Eastern Front and in Northern Europe, frostbite casualties rivaled combat losses. Soldiers wore thick socks, heavy leather boots, and still lost toes. What changed the outcome was not thicker insulation or heavier leather, but a counterintuitive boot system that military doctors and engineers quietly refined under pressure. It was a method that broke with common sense at the time, stopped heat loss at its source, and remains misunderstood even today. This guide explains that lost boot hack in detail and shows how it can still be applied by anyone facing sustained cold exposure. This section explains why traditional boots failed in extreme cold. Standard leather boots absorb moisture. Sweat from the foot-soaked socks condensed inside the boot and froze. Wet insulation loses heat rapidly, and leather stiffens in sub-zero temperatures, restricting circulation. Tight boots compounded the problem by reducing blood flow, which is the body's primary heat source for extremities. Soldiers were instructed to wear more socks, but this often made things worse by increasing compression. Military doctors eventually recognized that moisture, not temperature alone, was the true enemy. This section reveals the core World War II boot hack that changed outcomes. The breakthrough was the controlled use of vapor barriers combined with removable insulation. Instead of trying to keep feet dry by absorption, engineers accepted that feet sweat and stopped that moisture from entering insulation at all. Soldiers began wearing a thin barrier layer directly over the foot or inner sock. This barrier could be oiled fabric, rubberized material, or treated silk, depending on supply. Outside that barrier sat thick felt or wool insulation that stayed completely dry. The result was warmer feet, even though the inner layer felt damp. This section explains why the method worked when others failed. Heat loss accelerates when insulation becomes wet. By trapping moisture close to the skin, the insulation layer remained dry and fully effective. Body heat warmed the trapped moisture, creating a stable microclimate rather than evaporative cooling. The foot felt clammy but stayed warm. Circulation improved because boots no longer needed to be tightly packed with extra socks. This approach contradicted peacetime comfort logic, which is why it was resisted until battlefield evidence made it unavoidable. So, in this section, we're going to explore how World War II armies actually put the system into practice. German mountain units, Soviet winter troops, and Allied forces in Arctic conditions all, kind of converged on similar solutions. Felt-lined boots, mucklucks, and removable liners became standard wherever the cold was really severe. Soldiers were specifically instructed to dry liners separately and avoid letting moisture soak into the outer boot. Some units issued rubber overshoes or barrier socks, while others improvised using oiled cloth or even treated paper layers. But the principle always stayed the same. Insulation must stay dry, even if the foot itself does not. Now, this section explains why circulation was so important in the system. The vapor barrier system honestly only worked when boots were worn loose enough to let blood flow properly. World War II manuals, they really emphasized toe movement and making sure there was space inside the boot. A warm foot, after all, produces heat from within. Insulation just preserves whatever heat circulation provides. Soldiers were trained to adjust their lacing throughout the day and to avoid standing still for long periods. This kind of discipline ended up reducing frostbite far more effectively than just adding more insulation alone. So this section gives, some practical steps to apply the World War II boot hack today. Start with a thin inner sock made of wool or perhaps a synthetic fibre. Over that, place a vapour barrier layer. This can be a purpose-made barrier sock, a lightweight rubber layer, or even, in emergency conditions, a piece of treated fabric. Outside the barrier, wear thick insulating socks that remain dry. Choose boots with enough volume to avoid, compression. At rest periods, remove the barrier layer to allow your feet to air briefly, then reapply before moving again. And it's important to accept the sensation of moisture as a sign the system is working, not failing. Now, this section explains why, quite often, modern gear ignores this lesson. Modern boots prioritize breathability, assuming moisture can always escape. In extreme cold, though, breathability fails because vapour condenses and freezes inside the insulation. World War II engineers solved this by, frankly, controlling where the moisture went rather than trying to eliminate it altogether. Some modern cold weather systems quietly reintroduce vapour barriers, but many users abandon them due to discomfort. The historical record shows quite clearly that discomfort is preferable to frostbite. Here we're placing the hack in its proper historical context, not as a myth, but as a real adaptation. This was not a single invention, but rather an operational adaptation refined through medical data and field reports. Units that adopted vapour barrier principles saw frostbite rates drop sharply. Those that clung to dry foot assumptions, they continued to suffer. After the war, the method fell out of civilian use because, simply put, comfort replaced survival as the priority. The knowledge never disappeared, but it stopped being taught. So, just to reinforce why this knowledge still matters, World War II's secret boot hack succeeded because it addressed the real cause of cold injury, not just the symptoms. Moisture management, circulation, and insulation discipline saved countless toes and, honestly, lives. For historians, outdoorsmen, and survival practitioners, this method remains one of the most effective cold weather foot strategies ever developed. If this guide strengthened your understanding of historical fieldcraft and practical survival science, do consider subscribing to the channel. Share this episode with others who take cold seriously and help preserve knowledge that, even today, still works when conditions turn unforgiving.